Jay Johnson. He's an internationally renowned speaker specializing in behavior and organizational development. His 2018 TEDx talk introducing behavioral intelligence as a model for managing a conflict reached nearly 2 million people and established him as an authority on human behavior in workplace. Jay works with executives and business leaders globally to help transform their behaviors, develop successful enterprises, and build profitable cultures from startups to Fortune 100 companies. So here is Jay Johnson with behavioral mastery and business success, maximizing performance through behavioral intelligence. Jay, the stage is yours. Please unmute yourself.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you today. I'm really excited to talk about behavior. We've heard from some fantastic speakers today about digital technologies and how that influences leadership. One of the things that I never want us to forget is that leadership really does imply a human element. And for us to be able to manage that, to have behavioral intelligence is our way for us to be able to better manage. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. So I'm going to ask you a question. What if we were able to give you the capability of reading minds? What would you do with that? How would you operationalize that to be something that's a value proposition for your business? And while we often think of mystics or psychics when we think of mind reading, it's not really quite that complicated. Behavior are patternistic, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. So let me define behavioral intelligence for you. Very simply, it is the skills and ability to accurately explain existing behavior, predict future behavior, influence other people's behavior, and then manage and control our own behavior. And through the talk today, I'm hoping to give you a couple of tips and tactics on how you can do that better in order to foster that behavioral intelligence. But why is that important? Behavior is a choice, and every single day, every action, you have a choice of whether you're here right now and actually watching this, or whether you have decided to take an afternoon nap, or whether you've decided to have the volume down. All of those different things are choices, and choices have consequences. So when we look at behavior, we don't necessarily make a value statement on whether the behavior is good or whether a behavior is bad. Behaviors have positive consequences and behaviors can have negative consequences. And sometimes they can have both. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, it is your choice. So there are things in this world that we can't control. We have no control over other people's behavior. We have no control over a global pandemic. We have no control over technology sometimes. It acts the way that it wants. But the thing that you do have the ultimate control over is your own behavior and how you manifest that behavior to either lead to success or failure. And that's really our starting point, is that behavior is the core of all success and failure. If you go back to any project that you've participated on and found that that project failed, more than likely, you're going to be able to look back and see a number of different behaviors that created that failure situation, whether it was time management, productivity, habits, or even conflict. All of those are behavioral focused. But if you look back and find a project that you were successful in, my guess is that you're going to be able to find those behaviors that led to that success, whether that was collaboration, innovation, problem solving. All of those things are behaviors. So behavior is the core of all success and failure. But let's dive a little deeper into this behavioral intelligence thing, because quite frankly, over the last 10 years, this is something that I've really focused on. Behavioral intelligence comes from three different disciplines: the discipline of neuroscience, psychology, and communications. And those three are really the pillars and standpoints for behavior. And all of the past work on behavioral intelligence has really only focused on either one of those disciplines. This more robust and the four quadrants: explain, predict, influence, and control, gives us a nice framework to be able to operate both as leaders and as business leaders. And it applies to virtually every aspect of business. Whether it's sales, you're selling to people and you're taking that opportunity to understand them, know them, and influence them. Whether it is leadership, again, dealing with people and managing their behaviors, but also the behavioral culture of your organization. Whether it's conflict and you're dealing with that difficult person, well, that's a behavioral aspect. And hopefully through this short talk and short masterclass, you're going to have a couple of tools to walk away with to improve your behavioral intelligence. So let's look at explain. Explaining is the ability to determine the causes of behavior. When we think of behavior, and if you've ever listened to any of Simon Sinek's talks, he talks about the limbic system and our emotional capacity for decision making and our emotional capacity that drives behavior. And that's exactly right. But there's a lot of contributing factors that bring about how we choose to behave. Part of it is we're born with certain genetics. We heard from a speaker earlier that was talking about the book Sapiens. I absolutely agree. One of the most fantastic reads. Gives you a nice genealogy of the human existence for 300,000 years. Well, that evolution has really developed different aspects of our brain, such as the limbic system that drives our survival, fight, flight, and faint. We also see not just genetics, but we also see nurturing. So how we were raised, how we were brought up, the behaviors that we've learned, and then the behaviors that we execute. You're not limited to a personality assessment. You're not limited, because we've seen people act outside of their own personality or act outside of their normal behaviors. We have a choice. So being able to explain those, looking at that, is something that's absolutely essential for any leadership or any business in the modern century. One way that you can learn a little bit more about your behaviors is a behavioral elements assessment that we have created. So this is going to tell you your 4 quadrants and your preferences. That doesn't mean that you're stuck with your preferences. But if you're interested, this is a free assessment that you can take. It'll give you your behavioral preference. I happen to be a fire myself, and I know that there is a couple other speakers on here who are also fires, and that means I'm driven, competitive. I'll push the boundaries and try to win, versus our air, which is much more the innovative and entrepreneur side, our earth, which is our process and systems focused side, and our water, that's our collaborative and people side. Where your preferences ultimately end up lie can tell you a lot about how you actually view the world, how you make decisions, how you communicate. And learning that aspect can help you to understand other people, in which case you can make better connections with them simply by matching their communication styles. But we'll get to mirroring in just a little bit. Emotions. These are the things that we have zero control over. Emotions can wash over us. We can get frustrated at the drop of a hat. Somebody can say something that just absolutely drives us nuts, and but we can choose how we actually manifest those behaviors. Now, understanding emotions and being able to explain emotions really takes a high level of emotional intelligence. And those two things, behavior and emotional intelligence, play hand in hand with each other. So when we think about behavior, we also have to think about the emotions that ultimately drive those behaviors. How can we improve that? By becoming aware and more aware of our emotions. When we say something like angry, well, are we really angry, or are we frustrated? Are we anxiety driven? Are we mad? All of those different nuances of emotions actually have an impact on how we react inside of the world and our behaviors. So being able to explain those behaviors is an essential first step. And there's a whole host of resources to be able to explain that. Once we're able to explain, though, then we can move on to prediction. Now, the prediction aspect is the ability to identify behavioral patterns and deduce future behaviors. So this is that psychic readings of predicting the future, except it's not really all that psychic. We all know that behaviors are patternistic. Otherwise, you have probably noticed that you have certain routines or habits, or you have certain reactions that are going to happen and occur pretty frequently. The reality is humans are so complex in the brain, but we're also very, very simple. Ultimately, a lot of our behavioral patterns stem from 2 things. One is we go towards pleasure, and 2 is we go away from pain. So imagine yourself, you hear the alarm clock go off in the morning, and if you're like most people, you reach over and you hit the snooze button. Why? Because the pain of getting out of bed, you're in that comfort zone, you're in that nice, warm, cozy place. Well, getting up and going to work is going to be more painful. So we hit the snooze and we delay that. This is also where a lot of motivation comes from, the delay of painful actions or delay of something that our brain says is painful. We are very much the mouse in the maze. When we are doing some kind of behavior and that results in a reward, we get dopamine or we get oxytocin, and that makes us feel good. It makes us feel happy. So at that point in time, we go and find the cheese again. We do it over and over and over because that resulting feeling that comes from it is our reward system. Now, if we touch the stove and we burn our hand, well, at that point in time, our memory systems kick in, our hippocampus, and it tells us, don't do that again, because if we do that, it creates pain. That memory system also functions from an emotional construct too. So when we find ourselves in an emotional situation that brings us pain, our memory tells us, don't get into that. Don't have that difficult conversation. Don't deal with that person over there because the last time we got burned by that person. We're not all that different from running towards the cheese or towards the pleasure or towards that reward system and running away from the potential threats of the day. If we understand that, then we can actually look at the patternistic behaviors that people have. We can understand how people are going to behave in the future by what systems reward them. That really gets into different things such as intrinsic drives, those motivational aspects that are inside us. So the intrinsic drive for health or status, ego, power, competition, justice, all of those different intrinsic drives can help push our behaviors forward. Now, if we can explain those behaviors, and we've seen them in the past, and then we can model those behaviors and look at the patterns, that gives us the ability to predict. Once we can predict and once we can know what people are thinking, well, that's essentially mind reading. Now, how can we do that? We can see that through body language. We can see that through past behavioral actions. We can see that from emotional reactions in other people. Really, one of the keys to behavioral intelligence is awareness. And if we become aware of our surroundings and really look at the nuances of behavior, we engage in one of the most powerful tools for business. You look at a successful salesperson, they're able to read the scene in front of them, and then they're able to apply an influence tactic. And that's our third pillar of behavioral intelligence. Influence is the ability to create change in others. We can change their attitudes, we can change their beliefs, we can change their behaviors. Behavior is one of the hardest things to change. There's actually great studies going on right now about implicit bias training, that when people go through implicit bias training, it actually changes their attitudes and it changes their knowledge and it changes their understanding. However, it doesn't always have an effective behavioral change. So how do we really influence other people? How do we get them to change their behavior? One of the fastest ways is cognitive empathy. And you may have heard of this referred to as tactical empathy. So when I teach sales or when I teach negotiations or when I teach any of those other things, one of the things that we really focus on is how can you utilize something like cognitive empathy in order to get into the mind of somebody else? So when we think about cognitive empathy, some people will say, well, empathy is like sympathy. But no, empathy is a lot more complex than just the simple, I feel for you. If we say I feel for you, or I can understand why that would hurt your feelings or anything else, we might be experiencing emotional empathy. We might understand the emotions that are driving somebody else. If we say, gosh, you know, your pain is actually causing me pain too. I feel your pain literally inside me. That's more of a compassionate empathy. Cognitive empathy is more tactical. It's the ability to say, I can understand, I can explain and predict why that person's doing that. It's literally getting inside of the head and understanding the behaviors. So cognitive empathy allows us to create connections with people on a deeper level. I'm going to tell you a quick story, one that I love about when I was younger, and I sat through this psychological evaluation, and I went through an entire program, in which case we were learning about cognitive empathy. And I did this exercise with a person where they shared all of their challenges. And my initial reaction was to just, well, you could do this, you could do this, you could do this, because I'm a problem solver by nature. I'm a consultant. I love solving problems. So I gave them all of these answers. And then when we were brought back to the main room, they were asked, how is Jay as a listener? And they said, well, I didn't feel like he listened or really understood what my issues were. I didn't understand what he meant. I was like, how is that possible? I just gave you all these solutions. I was sent back with a different partner and given a script to just, the only thing that I could say was, I can understand how that'd be frustrating. I can understand where that would come and make you feel this way. Yeah, you absolutely have a right to feel this way. And all of a sudden, we went back to this room and they asked, how is Jay as a listener? And the person was like, wow, I really felt a connection to Jay. Like I felt like he was there for me and he listened, and all of a sudden my mind was blown. This whole concept of acknowledgement, this whole concept of being with somebody through that cognitive empathy progress is one of the most influential ways that you can actually develop your team. It's one of the most influential ways that you can develop your sales. So one of the ways in which we do that is through the mirror neuron process in our psychology. When I smile, it's very difficult for somebody to not smile back. When I raise my voice, it may make you want to raise your voice as well. If I lower my voice and I take it to a place like this, can you imagine if I talked like this the whole speech? It would be very boring. So when we look at something like mirror neurons, we actually have an ability, built-in capacity to model the people's behavior that we're interacting with. That gives us the opportunity to influence because we become similar. We become building rapport. So if you're able to model the correct behaviors, now that takes control and we'll talk about that. But if you're able to model those behaviors and show and demonstrate that, you will actually get that feedback in return and can build a continuous influence loop with the people that you interact with. Finally, control, the ability to manage our behavioral reactions. This is absolutely critical. There is a very small window, there is a space between our decision making. From the point that we feel something or from the point that a stimulus comes in and forces us to want to behave, there's this tiny, tiny window that we get to make a choice. And sometimes we don't feel like that window's there. Sometimes we just react, or we think we had no time, we just did it, and then we regret it. But there's actually a time window in between there. How can you learn more about that? By managing your autonomic emotional systems, learning about how those emotions wash over you and pausing and directly, specifically managing that space in between, because that is what allows you to get behavior as a choice. And your choices have consequences. So managing that control, learning that space, and managing that time. Every behavior is a decision. Nothing is accidental. We do this intentionally. Behavior has a purpose. And if you can learn to control and manage that space from where you think something and act on it, or from where you feel something and say something, that is the power of control and behavioral intelligence. And remember, behavior is a choice. And by improving our behavioral intelligence, you will have the opportunity to increase influence, to understand the people around you, to read their minds, to hear their thoughts before they ever necessarily speak them out loud, to discern truths, and to make connections that build the relationships. Because if people like you, they'll do business with you. If they don't like you, they'll do everything they can to sabotage you. So I'm hoping today you can take a look at some of these different aspects to improve your behavioral intelligence, to develop your mastery of behavior, because all success is rooted in behavior. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jay, for very interesting speech. And I have a question from my side. How can I change my habits?
That's a great question. So habits are something that's really interesting. How do we create a habit? We oftentimes, it's a four-part process. There's a cue. Something tells us, we see something. So for example, I wake up in the morning and my cue is, oh, I'm tired. So I start a craving. Therefore, I say, I want coffee. I go and get my coffee, and that is, the actual aspect that is going to solve that craving. And then I feel better, and that's the reward. And that system just goes over and over and over again. That function is actually in our temporal lobe. It's in the frontal lobe of our brain, where we want something, we behave, and then we're either rewarded or punished. How can you change your habits? By hacking into your system. So for example, if I want to start a new behavior, I'm going to tie it to a behavior I already have. So say I want to take a multivitamin every day. I take that multivitamin, I put it next to the coffee maker, because I know every morning I'm going to go make my coffee. Well, now that cue for the multivitamin is directly there in front of me. That's called habit stacking. There's also ways to make behaviors easier. If you want to work out, make it so it's easy to work out. The more barriers that you have in the way will change the way that you operate within that habit. If you reduce those barriers, it makes it so much easier to do. The other thing is to start small. If I want to get in shape or good shape, going to the gym for 4 hours in the first time is not reasonable. Start with 2 push-ups. And then the next day do 3 push-ups. And then the next day do 4 push-ups. You can start so small that it takes only a few seconds to start a behavior. But once you establish behavior and it rewards you, you want to do it again. And that's one of the best ways that you can change habits.
Well, thank you so much. And one more question. How can I build influence quickly with the people that I lead?
That, again, that really comes down to, do the people that you lead feel that you care for them? Are you there for them? Are you the leader that is going to actually care about their success and value? Because human beings, we all have that element of limbic system, our own self-survival, our own self-protection. So if you want to establish influence very quickly, show that other person how you care for them and what you're going to do to elevate their status. How are you going to put food on their table? That really comes into that cognitive empathy and learning, really discerning, what do they care about? Do they care about financial resources? Do they care about environmental causes? Do they care about health and well-being? Tapping into that cognitive empathy and then being able to show them and lead them in a way that helps them personally, but also aligns with your organizational mission. There is nothing better than helping people to establish and find and discover and go for their purpose. If you do that, that is an aspect of cognitive empathy. You will build influence incredibly quickly, and it'll be long lasting.
Thank you so much, Jay. And one more question. What tools can I use to deal with difficult people?
Everybody has to deal with difficult people. So 2 things that I'm going to remind you, and this was actually the topic of my TEDx talk in 2018, was behavioral intelligence as it's applied to dealing with difficult people. 1, keep this in your mind. This will help you have the space to be able to make the decisions. It's your heart attack. Somebody else's bad behavior causes all kinds of neurological reactions that pump cortisol and adrenaline and norepinephrine into your system. That causes heart failure. Those are stress hormones. When we have too much of that, ultimately it has an impact on ourselves. So do yourself a favor. Remember, it's your heart attack. And somebody else's bad behavior should not be the cause of your heart attack. That'll lead you to asking a question. Is this the hill that I want to die on? Is this so bad that I have to have this fight or this argument? And being able to take that and pull back from some of those difficult behaviors, or to be able to manage them, is a much more effective cognitive way to deal with those challenges. The other thing is to utilize some of that tactical and cognitive empathy in order to really understand, why is that person difficult? If I can discern what behaviors that person exhibits, well, then at that point in time, I can exert some influence over their behaviors and manage my own behaviors and control my behaviors for a better output and for a better outcome.
Well, thank you once again. And you were talking about behavioral intelligence and emotional intelligence. Is there any difference between them?
Yeah, absolutely. So emotions are invisible. We can't see them, we can't touch them, but behaviors are a visible aspect. They're a manifestation that often comes from emotions. I like to talk about emotional intelligence and behavioral intelligence as this beautiful marriage when you have both of those things. And it really does require both, because if I understand emotions, but I still behave poorly, the consequences are still there. Think about it almost in terms of like a card game. Like if you're playing poker and somebody gives you cards and you have cards, you don't get to choose your cards. You don't get to see the other person's cards. That's like the emotions. So in poker, what are you doing? You're playing the table. You're playing the behaviors of the other player. You're playing all of that. You still have to know how those cards work and function in the game, but you also have to be able to play the external factors that give you an advantage. There's a reason why the top poker players win every single year, or in year after year they're at the final table. It's because they have the capacity to know how the cards work, the emotions, but also how the players work, the behaviors and the betting at the table.
Thank you so much, Jay. And I want to remind everybody that with us was Jay Johnson with a very interesting topic, behavioral mastery and business success, maximizing performance through behavioral intelligence. Thank you, Jay, once again.